Welcome everybody. We have Dr. Sean Gabb here today, who's Director of the Libertarian Alliance, which is one of the first and foremost libertarian groups in the UK. He was Economic and Political Advisor to the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Slovakian Republic. And he's going to talk on left and right libertarianism, the differences between which one we should prefer, I suppose. And I'll let you explain yourself.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the Oxford Libertarian Society for having had the goodness to invite me here this evening, and I'm very impressed at the turnout. I did one in Keele University a few years ago, where there was the chairman of the Libertarian Society sat beside me, the secretary sat over there, and somebody far up the back who was a bit drunk or drugged had come in to see what was going on. That was actually a good event, but I'm sure this will be a much better event. So thank you for having come out, and I hope at the end of the evening you think, that was all right. Okay, the subject on which I've been asked to speak is libertarianism, left or right? Are we, as libertarians, on the right or on the left? Now, the get-at answer to that question is to say, I deny the validity of these categories. Left and right are concepts which emerged in the 1790s in the French National Assembly. Those people who were sitting on the far right of the horseshoe arrangement, that they were the monarchists. The people sitting on the left, they were the Jacobins. And it made sense in France in the 1790s to have this talk of left and right. It may have made some sense in other times and other places, but surely nowadays in the 21st century, left and right are redundant concepts. And so why should we even consider fitting ourselves into these categories? That is the get-at answer. The true answer is that libertarians are perceived by outsiders as on the right. For the most part, we do generally perceive ourselves as on the right. I see myself as on the right, and so even if only as a social category, left and right do still make some sense. And let's be honest about it. If one of us as a libertarian turns up to a gathering of conservatives, we do quite often find that we have a lot to talk about on a very friendly basis. Whereas if you go along to a Labour Club meeting, you will be seen as, at the very least, somewhat exotic. And so we are, reasonably speaking, on the right. Perhaps we shouldn't be, but we are. And what I want to discuss is how this came to be, and to what extent it should be allowed to continue. Now, if you look at the history of libertarianism, or the liberal movement, which begins in this country, for a long time, the people we would regard as libertarians saw themselves, in modern terms, as on the left. If you go back a long way to the 15th, 14th and 15th centuries, Jack Ball was it when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? Now, in those days, people we would regard as libertarians were very much against the established order of king, church, and the aristocracy. If you move into the 17th century, the levellers, people like Colonel Rainborough, was it, I really think that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the richest he. Now these people were not part of the established order. They saw themselves as in conflict with the established order. If you move into the 18th century, the Commonwealth men, the radical pamphleteers, the London Corresponding Society, all of the parliamentary reformers, the economic reform people, or you move into the 19th century, the people who saw themselves as opposed to a corrupt and oppressive established order, even people like Cobden and Bright. They were radicals, they were outsiders. They saw the established order as a parasitic growth which needed to be thrown off, or at the very least trimmed back. And these people would have been very surprised, I imagine, if they could come forward and see the people who regard them as their heroes as on the right. So how is it that a movement which began and for many centuries continued as an attack on the established order became, by the late 20th century, in many cases virtually indistinguishable from the conservative movement, and which was, and to some extent still remains, very closely identified in this country with the Conservative Party, and in America, although there is a Libertarian Party, in America many Libertarians decide to identify themselves with the Republican Party. How is it that this did come about? And the answer lies in the middle years of the 19th century, in England and to some extent in America, though I will concentrate on England because we are in England and it is the country that I know best. What happened from about the 1860s, you can't put dates on these very easily, but what happened from the late 1860s onwards in England is that you had a growth of what we can call the administrative state, the growth of a civil service which was competent to manage increasingly large areas of the national life. All of these local health, all of these health boards, education committees, agencies of the state, which in today's terms seem rather trifling, they seem very modest, but in those days they were rather radical. Municipal socialism, gas and lighting and street cleaning, all of this sort of thing, the growth of an administrative state where you have full-time paid officials with full-time paid expert advisors planning and managing increasingly large areas of the national life. You then have what may have been an autonomous change within the English liberal movement, and certainly within the Liberal Party. In the 1850s, the Liberal Party was very much about cutting taxes, reducing the scope of government intervention over the people's lives. By the late 1860s, certainly by the early and middle 1870s, you have liberal politicians who are talking increasingly about things like state education, state welfare, a certain redistribution of land, which may not be seen as necessarily very socialist, but you have the increasing injection of socialist ideas into English liberal thought, or perhaps you shouldn't use the word socialist, statist ideas, that's it. The idea that the state can be used to improve the condition of the people. Joseph Chamberlain in the 1881 election, 3 acres and a cow. Joseph Chamberlain, who had been the mayor of Birmingham and who had been responsible for a great deal of local state activity. These people then began to talk about old age pensions, they began to talk about national efficiency, all sorts of things. And you had, if you were a libertarian in today's terms in England in the 1870s, certainly by the 1880s, you would find that what you had long regarded as your natural home within the Liberal Party was becoming increasingly unwelcome to you. Are you familiar with Herbert Spencer's Man Against the State? Yes. Long chapter in that called The New Toryism, in which he says that the main driving force of statism was no longer the Tory party, no longer the party of church and state. It was now actually the Liberals, with their building codes, with their local government gas and lighting and electricity companies, talking about telephone nationalisation, using the state monopoly of the telegraphs and so on, consolidating that. And Herbert Spencer said, you know, increasingly I find myself more at home with old-fashioned conservatives than I do with people who call themselves liberals. And this continued right the way through to the end of the 19th century, right the way through to the Great War. Libertarian intellectuals, Herbert Spencer, Wordsworth, Donisthorpe, W.H. Mallock, and all sorts of libertarians decided to, well, they didn't decide, they found themselves compelled to get into bed with the conservatives. This, of course, was given added impetus in the 1920s, after the Russian Revolution, when the socialist movement in this country became very much more statist, very much more radical. Many Labour Party people in the 1900s called themselves socialists, but they were not terribly statist into those terms. But they would have fitted very easily in with much of early liberalism. But by the 1920s, you had a very statist, very socialist Labour Party, and beyond the Labour Party, you had large numbers of intellectuals who wanted to turn England into a Bolshevik state. And then, if you were a libertarian, you really had no choice but to identify yourself with the old order, with the Conservative Party. The Liberal Party itself split during the Great War, and this split solidified after the Great War, and many of the more libertarian or more liberal of the liberals simply drifted off and became indistinguishable from the Conservative Party. I should say that the Conservatives were not the passive recipients of this interest from libertarians. I would say that there always has been a very strongly libertarian strand within English conservative thinking. When you talk about English conservatism, you're not talking about a mindless love of order, a belief in the divinely ordained order of king, church and aristocracy. English conservatism has always been about trial by jury, freedom of the press, a great deal of independence of ordinary people from state supervision. Of course, this was always mixed up with a defence of the landed interest. Though I would say that, and Jock will disagree with me on this, I would say that the landed interest in late 19th century and early 20th century England was objectively libertarian, so far as these people tended to balance and sometimes even to check the growth of the administrative state. The landed interest may not have had much interest in a completely independent and self-reliant working class, but they certainly didn't want state-salaried school teachers, state-salaried inspectors, the kind of people who would get in their own way. And so the English conservative movement was quite a welcoming place for libertarians. And as we move into the late 20th century, what you do find is that political life has been compressed. When I was your age 30 years ago, politics was a tug of war. On the one side, you had those people who broadly thought that state socialism was a good idea, and the heaviest weight on that side of the tug of war was the old Labour Party, and even to some extent the Communist Party of Great Britain. On the other side, you had the Conservatives who didn't like this, and if you were a Libertarian, you had to decide which side of that tug of war you were going to join. And for most of us, the choice was made for you. Are you going to call yourself a mutualist, a geo-anarchist, or whatever you want to call yourself, and find yourself having to rub shoulders with various Soviet front organisations, or will you swallow a few of your principles and and join in with various right-wing conservatives who believe in hanging, flogging, and the suppression of porn, and sort of getting the police into public toilets to make sure that men are not misbehaving? And are you going to smile at and even take money from organisations like British Petroleum and various other well-funded corporate interests? Which side do you take? And again, I'd say that 30 years ago, the choice was made very much for you. You were in favour of corporate capitalism. You were in favour of actually existing capitalism with all its faults, or you were in favour of an alternative to corporate capitalism, which was very much worse from a libertarian point of view. And so an identification which began in late Victorian England with the drifting of the Liberal Party away from what we would regard as core liberal principles was solidified during the 20th century in this great existential battle over state socialism. And so when I was your age and I came out as a libertarian, various people said, "Oh, Tory fascist bastard, aren't you?" And, well, yes, I was. Yes, I was a Tory. Indeed, I am a Tory. As far as I was concerned in those days, it didn't matter how dirty the mix was with actually existing capitalism. It was the only alternative to something that was very much worse. And of course, once you are on that side of the argument, your friends are conservatives, you begin to think like a conservative. If, like me, you started as a conservative, it's even better. And so libertarianism became an adjunct to conservatism in this country and in the United States. And it didn't matter how often we would stand up and say, well, we are very different from conservatives. We believe in legalizing drugs. We don't believe that the state should supervise what people do in their bedrooms. We are libertarians. It didn't matter. We were rather exotic conservatives. And so it has continued. Now, does it need to be this way, though? And the answer is no, because that great tug of war that defined politics in the 20th century came to an end 20 years ago. The collapse of actually existing socialism, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, meant that you no longer needed to be frightened of people who define themselves as on the left. And there have always been libertarians on the left, people who were not very happy with all these communist front organisations, not very happy with all these people shuffling around selling copies of the Socialist Worker and Morning Star and bits of money turning up from nowhere in particular, but with various invisible strings attached. But they didn't like the Conservatives, and so they found themselves on the left. Well, there is no reason nowadays why we should refuse the hand of friendship to and from these people. There has been a collapse of this left and right spectrum, and I think we are in a very good position to take advantage of this. The problem is, one of the problems, forgive me, is that for many of us, we have so internalized the idea that we are on the right that we often do not think in very libertarian ways. One of the examples of this, which we can see at the moment, the way in which the cuts are being discussed. Now, we can all agree, perhaps we can all agree, that the government in this country the state in this country is far too big. It needs to be cut back. It needs to be cut back not simply because £1 of every 4 the government's spending is borrowed. The state needs to be cut back because the state is a parasitic growth that is in itself a bad thing. And so the financial crisis is not simply a reason for cutting the state. The financial crisis is an excuse for cutting the state. However, look at the cuts that are being applied. In the past few days, I've heard that child benefit is being withdrawn from families who earn more than a rather trifling sum of money. And the saving might be as much as £1 billion, it may be rather less. Of course, if you're in my position, child benefit counts as a tax cut. It's a tax rebate. You see, we pay vast amounts of money in income tax, and we get back, how much is it, £1,200 a year or something, £1,000 a year in child benefit. That's now being withdrawn, and that means that we end up paying more tax. And as you move further down, people earning about £26,000, £27,000 a year, which is not very much at all, they also will lose their child benefit. Now, when you're on less than £30,000 a year, that child benefit is worth something, and it's being withdrawn from those people. Other cuts. It means that if you get a council house, you'll have to pay 80-90% of a market rent for it, and you'll not be able to have this property for life. Now you may say, oh, no one should have a council house. Well, perhaps not. About 80% of us, about 80% of households in this country are owner-occupiers. The 20% of people who are not, and most of those people live in council accommodation, they are very poor. Some of them may have made themselves poor through unwise lifestyle decisions, but many of those people are poor because they're poor, or because they've been made poor or kept poor by the state. And what we're doing, or what the government is doing, is imposing spending cuts on those people. They're sorting out the financial crisis by cutting off welfare to those people. All sorts of little welfare benefits, or if you're at the bottom, quite large welfare benefits, are being cut back in order to deal with this structural budget deficit. But you see, the amounts of money concerned are not very great. If the government manages to save 10 or 20 billion pounds by cutting welfare in this way, I shall be surprised. Of course, if that was the only way in which the budget deficit could be cut, then I'm afraid it has to be done. But it isn't, is it? Look at all the other money that the British government does spend. £11 billion a year to the European Union, £13 billion a year on foreign aid. I believe £2 billion of that goes to a nuclear-armed India with a space programme. Much of the rest ends up in various Swiss bank accounts or in the profit and loss account of companies like British Aerospace. That isn't being cut. The climate change scam, £18 billion a year of public spending. And most of this money, the European Union budget, the aid budget, the climate change budget, and most of the other money spent on all sorts of contributions to international bodies, is salaries and pensions for rather well-off people. I keep thinking lately of people like Elspeth Howe, the wife of Sir Geoffrey Howe. All of these people who sit on committees, all very grand people with large salaries, very plush pensions, and you see all of those budgets are not being cut. Very few people at the top who live on various kinds of state handouts, very few of those people will suffer anything at all. Instead, the government is demonising the poor and cutting their welfare, and we are expected to cheer these people on, saying, yes, yes, right on, you know, these scroungers, why should they get child benefit, why should they get housing benefit, why should they get this, why should they get that? Well, you know, why should they get it? Because in many cases, it is because they live in a country where they have been systematically prevented from shifting for themselves. It is very difficult, if you are at the bottom of society, to make yourself independent, or to make yourself what Kevin Carson calls respectably poor. Back in the 1980s, I remember the Conservative praise of small business. We must celebrate small business. But the reason we were supposed to celebrate small business was because the small businesses of today are the big businesses of tomorrow. Well, perhaps we should stop doing that. Perhaps we should just celebrate small business simply because they are a way in which the poor can make themselves independent. Why should somebody not be allowed to open a little cafe in their front room? Why should people not be allowed to make sandwiches and sell them in the street? Why should people not be allowed to start these little micro businesses which do not make you rich and will not make you rich, which have rather poor cash accounting standards, but which give people a little bit of money here and there which will make them independent? Somebody once said to me, what does libertarianism have to offer somebody who works on a Tesco's checkout? And you can say, well, it means tax cuts. Well, these people don't pay much tax because they don't earn very much money. Well, they can live as they please. Well, largely they do, because they can take drugs, they can do this, they can do that. The authorities don't really interfere with them. What libertarianism can really offer people at the bottom is the ability not to have to work for organisations like Tesco. And moving on to organisations like Tesco, another traditional blind spot for libertarians has been big business. We celebrate big business because it is the outcome of a market competition in which the fittest survive. The reason why British Petroleum is so big and so rich is because it made all the right decisions. These were capitalist heroes who took risks and are now being rewarded for having taken the right kind of risks. Yes, you could look at it in that way. And there is a lot of entrepreneurship in big business. I don't share the contempt and hatred that many people feel for Microsoft. But at the same time, the reason why most big business in Britain and America is so big is because it is and has been the recipient of systematic state bias, incorporation laws that protect directors and shareholders from having to from the consequences of tort actions. It separates ownership and control of an organisation. Transport subsidies, which allow large organisations to take advantage of economies of scale which would otherwise not be worth having. All sorts of regulations. I was talking to Joff Coates earlier, who said that the impact of the regulatory burden is about 17 times greater on small businesses than on large businesses, which is effectively a subsidy to big business. It makes internal transactions much more economically viable than they otherwise would be. Back in the 1980s, you did feel a certain obligation to defend these large organisations, partly because they were throwing little bits of money your way, but also because the alternative to supporting an economy dominated by BP, BT, BA, BAE and all the others was having some kind of Michael Foot, Tony Benn, Arthur Scargill Soviet nightmare. But now that that Soviet-style nightmare alternative is no longer on the table, do we really need to turn a blind eye to the way in which business behaves? When, for example, BP made that mess up in the Gulf of Mexico, you can feel a bit of national pride in this. How dare this man attack a British company? But were the American authorities so very unreasonable when they demanded that BP should pay the full cost of the clean-up? Perhaps they weren't. Again, are we knee-jerk defenders of big business? Are we knee-jerk enemies of the poor? Or are we libertarians who believe in human freedom, which often means an attack on the structures of actually existing capitalism? And so, if I asked libertarianism left or right, I would say probably left. Though, as I said, I am myself rather conservative. But libertarianism, properly considered, is an attack on the structures of an administrative and corporate state, which may, in the past, have legitimized itself by talking the language of libertarianism in a rather cautious sense, but which is not even incidentally libertarian. And so, as we move forward into the 21st century, and this great 20th century tug of war recedes into the background, perhaps we should be taking a much more openly sceptical line than we so far have done, with the way in which conservative parties and big business behave. Perhaps we should, to some extent, begin to sound like lefties. Anyway, I've now spoken for half an hour, and I think that's long enough to say everything that I want to, and it's really over to you.
So if anyone would like to ask questions, then do you want to take them?
Of course. Well, questions, statements, everything.
I really enjoyed the talk for a start. I was quite surprised actually at the start with the statements, and they were quite reasonable. But I actually would probably see myself as a left-leaning libertarian. But I think that over the last 20 years, like you said, this tug of war being over, I mean, it doesn't seem to make sense to look at political parties, at least in this country, as having a very left or right leaning. And I think that shouldn't be the way that it's, as a libertarian, the way that you judge the parties nowadays. I mean, going back to core principles seems like a better strategy to me, because, I mean, if we look at, like you said, if we look at the tax cuts that are happening nowadays, they're not promoting freedom in any way. I mean, they're actually inhibiting social mobility. And I'm not saying that the past Labour government did very well on it, but it seems like there is actually a problem in the state, in the bureaucracy of it, that's stopping libertarian ideals actually coming to pass. And I'd just like to know your opinion on which way it is that it will fall.
Oh, you're asking me what we can do to bring about a more libertarian society? Search me. All right. Well, look, there are many ways of doing it. There are many possible ways of doing it, some of which might work, most of which might not work. One is that you join a political party, the Conservatives or Liberal Democrats. I don't suppose Labour is worth considering. You join a political party, you work your way up through the you get yourself selected for a reasonably safe seat, you get into Parliament and argue for libertarian ideas. And over the past 30 years, I have seen a number of men who started out as libertarian activists who put on suits and became Conservative candidates and who are now in Parliament, and who somewhere along the line stopped being libertarians. I think Murray Rothbard used to ask, why is it that our friends never get into positions of influence? And his answer was, because the moment they get into positions of influence, they stop being our friends. And I'm afraid I've seen that happen with the Conservative Party. I'm not saying that it's a total waste of time. There's always one or two who get through and who don't become too corrupt. I rather hope that Stephen Baker, the new Conservative MP for Wickham, is one of those people who will surprise us. Douglas Carswell is pretty good in the European Parliament, Daniel Hannan. So it's not a total waste of time. Many of the people who started out as our people moved increasingly towards the dark side of the force as they got deeper into politics. But it doesn't have to be that way. Other ways are to build the new society within the structures of the old. You set up non-state local networks of enterprise and of mutual help. And as the administrative state becomes more and more sclerotic and more morally bankrupt, these local networks will increasingly take the strain of social interactions until we can move gradually, insensibly towards a libertarian future. Now, the answer to that, an objection to that proposed course is that the moment these local networks become reasonably effective, the administrative state will stamp on them. Has anyone heard of the Islamic informal banking system? I think it's called Hawala. It emerged in the 1960s and 70s in this country for people who wanted to remit money to India and to other third world countries from which they had immigrated. They didn't really. We had currency controls at the time, exchange controls. The banks, even otherwise, would charge quite hefty commissions and so on. And so an informal banking system emerged in which you could take £100 to Mr. Patel's corner shop, you'd give it to him, he would then make a telephone call to his cousin in Calcutta, and £100 in rupees would be handed over to your cousin so that your niece's wedding could be celebrated. And this has become a very large and sophisticated parallel banking system. But the larger and the more sophisticated it's become, the more interested the regulatory authorities have grown. And of course, now that we have the war on terror, this is being sniffed out quite actively. We must stop this, because this is a way for terrorist and extremist organisations to be funded. Now, I've no idea how many of these £100 deposits in Mr. Patel's corner shop end up in Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan. I really have no idea, probably not very much at all. The real reason that the state is so interested is because tax is not being paid on these transactions, and the transactions themselves are not being monitored. The state must tax, and if it doesn't tax, it must monitor, it must inspect, it must monitor, it must control in various ways. And so the moment these networks become effective, they also become targets for state action and state disruption. Another possible way forward is to take the ideological route. You write, you publish, you argue, you organise meetings like this in which groups of the converted talk to each other and go out and proselytise, and we spread libertarian ideas to the point when we either take over the masses, turn the masses into libertarians, or we turn the intellectual classes into libertarians, at which point the state is downsized almost automatically. That's what the Libertarian Alliance has been trying to do for 30 years, not, I must say, with very much success. So how do we do it? I don't know. I've been involved in efforts to spread libertarianism now for 30 years, and to be perfectly honest, we have had almost zero success. That is not to say that we should continue to have zero success.
Sorry, could we sit in the back?
Of course. A more pessimistic answer to your question is that the age in which we live is not terribly propitious to libertarian ideas. And the best that we can do is to keep the ideas alive, to hand on to a next generation or the generation after next, when the time is maybe more favourable. A slightly less pessimistic variant of the argument is to look at what happened in the 1970s. The Institute of Economic Affairs was established, I think, in 1957, and for the first 15 years of its existence, it was totally ignored by the media. There's no deliberate conspiracy of silence, it's just that publishing pamphlets in 1967 on the need for strict control of the money supply didn't fit in with what anyone was discussing in politics at the time. And Ralph Harris used to drive off to the airport and pick up Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek and various other luminaries, bring them into central London, give them lunch, take them off to a seminar, and a pamphlet might come out of that which nobody read. And this literature piled up and piled up until one day in 1974, the entire paradigm of the Keynesian mixed economy welfare state collapsed. And the powers that be looked around thinking, oh dear, what are we going to do next? What shall we do? Shall we try radical socialism? Don't like the sound of that. Oh, what's this? IEA, monetarism. Oh, let's do that. And you see, if the IEA had not existed all through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, publishing all this stuff, which no one read, then when this turn of events happened in 1974, there would not have been a reasonably developed body of semi-libertarian thinking for the powers that be to embrace. There would not have been the monetarist revolution of the late 1970s. Now, what I'm saying is that you can publish books like this one that I published a few years ago, Cultural Revolution, Culture War, How Conservatives Lost England and How to Get It Back. I don't make any great claims to it, it just happens to be a book that I have to hand. This was published a few years ago. It has had no influence at all on the way in which the government behaves, but if you publish enough of these things and people discuss them, then it may be that in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years' time, the present order of things will collapse for some reason. Maybe it's only internal contradictions, it may be an external shock, it doesn't matter, but there may be another collapse. And the powers that be will look around for some other way to manage things, and they will choose that. And you see, if you hadn't spent year after year after year of pouring stuff onto the internet to have 500 of the same people read it and comment on it, and no one else to be aware of it, if you hadn't put in the time doing this stuff, then when the right moment comes, you'll miss your chance. So how do we get from here to there? I don't know. There are many ways of doing it, and there are objections to all of those ways. They may all be unsuccessful. I don't know, but the point is, whatever takes your fancy. If you fancy electoral politics, if you fancy handing out leaflets on street corners, if you fancy going along to public meetings and putting the Libertarian line, or if you want to write for the Libertarian Alliance, or whatever, if you want to set up your own radio or television station, just go and do it. And when someone comes up to you and says, that's not the right way to go about it, you should be doing it this way, your answer is, well, you do it your way, I'll do it my way, and we'll see if any of these ways does work. Sorry, that's not a very good answer to your question, but there is no easy answer to your question. We don't live in a libertarian age, and we must accept that.
So it sounds like Slovakia was a growing opportunity, and there were a number of you over there advising. I'm interested to know how that's going today. If any of those ideas have been retained, or if they've shifted back in a more statist direction.
Oh, right, okay. Well, the official line is this. In 1991, the Conservative Party sent a number of young, free market intellectuals out to places like the Slovak Republic, and I went out to Slovakia, and Tim Evans, the president of the Libertarian Alliance, went out to Slovakia, and Tom Gray, an American libertarian, went out to Slovakia. We all went out there, and we evangelized the Slovak government, and because of us, everything was privatized. And nowadays, you have a low-tax, low-regulation economy in Slovakia, and a vibrant libertarian movement, Ines, and magazines like Trend with Lukáš, Krivoshik, and all the rest of it. That's the official line. The truth is that there is actually no visible connection between any of these events. Tim and I went out to Slovakia in 1991. We wrote an enormous amount about the transition to a market economy. I don't think we had any real influence over what happened. My only visible achievement in Slovakia was to reorganise the secretariat of the Slovak Foreign Ministry. That was the limit of my achievement. I might have had some input into the introduction of due process protections in criminal law. But the problem from my point of view is that the only law I know is English common law, which doesn't translate very well into a Roman law environment, so probably no influence there. Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, all of these places, they took the European Union road, which in those days meant tax cuts, spending cuts, deregulation, and they did that because German big business wanted it, and the local politicians were desperate to get into the European Union, and so they embraced the European model, and they did it as well as could be expected. And now in Slovakia there is a growing libertarian movement which owes zero to Tim Evans and to me. But for reasons of vanity, we claim paternity. Sorry.
In your talk, you raised the point of what does libertarianism offer to cashiers at Tesco's?
Yes.
And I think you sort of glossed over all the things in your answer. You sort of said that if you just remove bureaucracy and the heavy hand of the state or whatever, these little tiny cottage industries can flourish, like sort of a shop in your front room or whatever. And I just think that's very idealistic, and I think actually most people of that class are going to have to spend their lives working for big business, and it's going to be horrible for them. And I think you can't just say, from an economist's point of view, that these cottage industries can just work perfectly and everyone's going to have a job and can have autonomy over that.
No, not at all.
I think it's just too idealistic to ever function in the real world. And obviously, as you know, poor people do pose the biggest problem for libertarians, I'd say, because it's people who are on the benefits and people who are very low income. And I mean, yeah, libertarianism doesn't hold very much for them.
Well, okay. Let me answer that as briefly as I can, because there are many other questions, but it's an important point you've raised. The main victims of the current order of things are not people like us. During your lifetimes, you will pay several £million in tax at the very least. But you see, you are clever enough and well educated enough and perhaps well connected enough to earn many millions of pounds so that you can pay this money and you will not be visibly worse off. The real victims of the present order of things are the poor. They are effectively indentured to various credentialed bureaucracies which plan their lives, supervise the education of their children, supervise their pension arrangements, run their lives for them, take their children away in many cases, and also shepherd them into these large bureaucratic organisations where they work for minimum wage, for peanuts. I'm not saying that
what about the rights of working class children not to be raised and educated by parents which actually can't educate them?
I accept that if you were to remove state supervision, some working class children would be brought up rather worse than they are at the moment. But I think that is a small minority. And in order to save that small minority from a very bad upbringing, what we are doing is subjecting all children to a close and searching bureaucracy which messes them up for life. Subjecting parents and adults and children to state mediation of virtually every interaction between them. At the moment, there are proposals for health inspectors to go into every home in the country to ensure that children are being brought up in a safe environment, to go and see if the stair gates are in the right place, to make sure that tables have little polystyrene protectors on them, that sort of thing. No, those are serious proposals. There are serious proposals to ban smoking in the home because it might give children asthma. In order to protect a few thousand or a few tens of thousands of working class children from being harmed, and even then I don't think it does protect them from being harmed, but in order to protect those children, we are messing up the lives of millions of children. But going back to your point about idealism, when I was a boy, my mother was left with 4 children. And she was rather hard up, and it was quite difficult for her to work as a nurse at the time because she had 4 children, all very closely grouped. And so what she did was she took in other people's children. She became a childminder. And so the neighbours would go out to work, they'd dump the little ones on my mother, she'd look after them all day, and she would make enough money from that, a bit of this, a bit of that. And we were never well off as children, but we were at least independent. Now you can't do that nowadays, because if you want to look after other people's children, you need to become a state-registered childminder. You need to have criminal records bureau checks made against you. You also need to be inspected by Ofsted. I put my daughter twice a week to a childminder, and the amount of bureaucracy that woman has to face is astonishing. I had to sign a form a little while ago allowing the childminder to apply suntan cream to my daughter. No, I'm serious. I had to sign a form allowing the childminder to take photographs of my daughter. I had to sign a form allowing Calpol, so that's sort of liquid paracetamol, to be given to my daughter if she sneezed or coughed, all sorts of things. I believe I probably had to sign a form allowing the childminder to touch her. Now we know from this case of a paedophile childminder in Plymouth that all of this bureaucracy does not stop a determined paedophile from getting access to children. You can get all the right checks, all the right bits of paper, and then you can go and take indecent photographs of children. What all of this bureaucracy does do is to stop the modern equivalent of my mother from becoming independent by setting up one of these micro businesses. You see, childminding is not high tech. It's not difficult. If you are a mother already, or a father, you know how to change nappies, you know how to look after children, you know what to do when they cry. It's not rocket science looking after children, and looking after other people's children so they can go out and do jobs is an obvious thing to do if you're hard up, but you cannot do it at the moment. You have a choice between going and getting some crap dead-end job in Tesco's or living on state welfare. And if you've got children and you can't go and do a crap job in Tesco's, you're stuck on state welfare. And that is something that we should regard as unacceptable. And that's one of the ways in which the administrative state dumps on the poor. And what Libertarian has to offer the poor in this respect is getting the state off their backs so that they can set up these micro businesses.
I just don't think it's feasible on a large scale, really.
Why not?
I just don't think there's a large amount of micro businesses would work on large. I just don't think there's a market for all these tiny businesses. Obviously, only one childminder in your area or whatever.
I do.
I think if you go sort of, I don't know, large acres and acres of council flats. You can't possibly imagine all these people setting up a micro business and work.
But is there not already a lot going on?
It doesn't have to be. Why does there have to be? What's something for everyone? If someone wants to do it, why would you stop them? He's not necessarily
I'm
business, but you're preventing people, and that's not fair.
No, I'm absolutely with you on that point. I just think.
Well, I mean, surely the black market. There's a private black market, is there not? And you look at the marijuana growers. So I think
It is what poor people do if they don't have jobs.
exactly, why not? I think it's an example that Carl Hess used was all these poor inner city people could be setting up these little hash stands in the streets.
Yes.
And they would be selling something that people want, and people would be getting a service and paying for it.
Yes, I've done that myself. Not not with cannabis. My contribution to the family budget when I was a boy, I've always been a rather keen winemaker, and I started making wine when I was 12, and I found that I could sell the stuff for £1 a bottle. Of course, I was breaking the law. It was, I wasn't paying a penny in excise duty, and if I was to do that nowadays, I can't imagine the regulations I'd be breaking. But why, making decent alcohol requires a certain amount of experience and forethought, and most people do not have the patience to do it. So, why shouldn't somebody just start making, you can make 100 gallons of wine very easily, you just need these big plastic tubs, and if you know how to do it, it turns out rather well. Why shouldn't people do that and sell it? At the moment they can't do it because you have the customs and excise on the back like anything. Plus, God knows what from the trading standards, the health and safety people and everything else. Why shouldn't people start brewing beer and wine and selling it to people? Growing marijuana and all the rest of it. So.
I mean, the standard arguments against that are things like, you can't check that everything's the right quality, you can't check what they're doing to it, and all those kinds of things. And I was just thinking, there are kind of empirical tests that you could think of in which we can kind of verify these libertarian ideas and somehow prove that actually freeing up all this bureaucracy is going to make things more efficient, going to in general be better for people than having it in place.
Yeah. It is actually very difficult to make poisonous wine. I mean, if you make wine with potatoes or tomatoes, it's not very good.
So, let's take, for example, babysitting.
Yes.
So, say, if we have a 6-month-old baby, the 6-month-old baby can't tell its parents whether it's, being looked after properly. And they might take, several years before they realise that actually the childminder's not looking after their children properly.
Well, there are many state-registered childminders at the moment who do a very bad job. I know because when my wife and I were looking for a childminder last year, we visited all the childminders in the area, and some of them were pretty awful. But they were the women who had enough common sense or enough determination to fill in all of those forms, tick all the boxes, and get through the officer inspections. It is not difficult to look after children. And again, another of my contributions to the family budget when I was a boy was that I'd be out babysitting. Imagine a 14-year-old boy left in charge of little tiny babies with no supervision, none whatever. And you see, most babysitters do not rape or murder the babies they're looking after. Most childminders do not lock the children up in cupboards or tie them up in front of a television set. Most people actually do a reasonable job. They don't do a reasonable job because the state has licensed them. They do a reasonable job because most people do a reasonable job. And the people who don't do a reasonable job soon get bounced out of the market. Sorry.
Yeah, I have two questions. My first question is how you define as a libertarian social justice, and if you think that libertarianism and social justice is connected, and if yes, how?
I think it was Hayek, it may have been someone else, I think it was Hayek who said that every noun is negated by the addition of the adjective social. So social justice is not justice. Social benefits are not benefits. So I can't answer your question. I don't have a definition of social justice that is very helpful. No, I can't answer that. Somebody else might want to.
Fairness. Try fairness.
Well, fairness is nothing. Yes, fairness is fairness. Yes. You can't define fairness, but you can recognise it.
It's an interesting article, I don't know if many people read it. It was by Jamie White. It's, I think, in the Wall Street Journal, so it's behind a paywall, but if you Google for it, you'll find it. And it was called Fairness is Charles playing British election campaign before the election. And he drew the distinction between Marxist conceptions of fairness, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, versus Aristotelian conceptions of fairness. Basically, there are rules that everyone follows, and beyond that, it's up to you.
Yeah. Well, actually, now you mention it, there's nothing wrong in itself with that Marxist slogan. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as it's not the state deciding abilities and needs.
Or as long as it's voluntary.
Well, as long as it's voluntary, yes, of course. That is how society operates, for the most part.
One of the examples in the article was that everyone's Aristotelian when it comes to sports. They don't argue that they should change the rules so that the All Blacks lose at rugby. The rules are the rules, and people accept it. Whereas you get into these strange models when it comes to taxation, because, for example, they claim to believe in equal pay for equal work, and yet if one person has a separate income, say from a rental property, then in their day job they're not allowed to have equal pay for equal work because the state will confiscate a portion.
Yes. Well, of course, we don't approve of that, do we?
No.
No.
I was wondering what your view on something like the NHS is.
Okay. The thing about the NHS is that it was a very bad system to set up, and it continues to be a very bad system. And there are so many reasons why it's a bad system, and I'm not really talking about things like waiting lists and limitation of access to medications. I find very often when I go on the radio to argue in favour of the right to smoke, the right to get drunk, the right to do this, that and the other, but I always get some smug lefty saying, well, it's all very well, isn't it, but these people's lifestyle decisions are costing us money because we had to pick up the pieces through the NHS. And what the NHS is coercive pooling of risk. If all of us in this room are paying in to an insurance fund, then it is surely only fair that we should stop. If you want to if you delight in setting fire to your beard, we should stop you from doing so because we might have to pay for skin grafts or something. And that's one of the problems with the NHS. It is a problem. It is a justification for the state regulation of lifestyle. However, how do you get rid of the NHS? We can talk until we're black in the face about the way in which the friendly societies operated in the 19th century and the decentralised market in healthcare that would have grown up without a centralised NHS. But we do have the NHS. It provides actually pretty reasonable healthcare for most people, and most people would not be capable of looking after their own health care without the NHS at the moment. So how do we get from here to there? I don't know. I suppose various ways we could do it would be to legalise drugs. And one of the main arguments for legalising drugs is not because it's nice for people to have the right to get high. It's also very useful to be able to look up your symptoms on Google and go and get the medications you think that will help you, because most people are perfectly capable of being their own doctors or of being their neighbours' doctors. Self-medication, the right to self-medication, would reduce our reliance on the NHS most remarkably. Another way forward would be to demonopolise the healthcare professions. why can only a doctor carry out certain procedures? Do you really need to do a simple filling, for example? How long does it take to train someone to do a simple filling? There are books on the internet on do-it-yourself dentistry. I don't recommend that you should follow the advice in them, but in an emergency it is surprising what you can do for yourself and for people around you with very little skill. Why do we need these very highly trained and very highly paid professionals to have the sole right to treat people with fairly simple complaints? Another way would be to get rid of all the regulations on the development of new medications. And another way, I suppose, would be a serious attack on intellectual property rights, which raise the price of drugs astonishingly. Once you've done that, then you may find that the NHS is much less necessary in people's lives than it is at the moment. But I'm afraid that the way in which the Conservatives, the way in which the coalition is operating at the moment, is that drug controls, medical monopolies, intellectual property rights and all the other regulations will be kept absolutely in place. And at the same time, the waiting lists for the NHS will be lengthened and many life-saving treatments will be denied to people on the NHS, which is the wrong way of going about it. It's not fair and it also isn't efficient.
I'd be interested to know how many people you know who are on benefits, because you said at one point that the poor are going to be hurt by the cuts, but anyone who knows a significant amount of people who are actually on benefits will know that they actually have more money and a higher standard of living than low-paid workers.
Yes, when my wife and I were very hard up in the 90s, we were often rather upset that the people living in the council flats opposite had satellite dishes when we couldn't afford a television set and had much nicer cars than we had. If you are reasonably dishonest and you know how to give the right answers to questions, and also if you live in extended family structures, so you're willing to look after each other's children and to socialise various costs, you can live rather well on benefits. But I'm not sure if that describes all welfare beneficiaries or even the majority of them. I do know people, I don't know anybody at the moment who is on benefits, but I do know people who have been on benefits, and it wasn't a very nice life for them.
Maybe not by your standards, but for instance, my stepsister has never worked, but she has had 3 children and used state money to get breast implants in Belgium. And I really, I don't think it's unfair to ask these people to take a little less money. And a lot of the time, people who are not on benefits don't actually realise the extent to which you can get money from the state. You're just not even aware of the amount of money. So,
do you know?
Could I just comment on that as a quite active question? I agree with you in kind of general the idea that in an ideal society everyone would be independent and wouldn't need to claim benefits. So I think that's kind of what you're driving at, and the idea that if you didn't give them benefits then they would be in a sense forced to be independent or at least incentivised. But I think that if the idea is we need to cut money off the budget, then or in some way reduce the burden on the people who are giving to society, then there must be much easier ways to cut money. For example, the sorts of laws like limited liability, and which you mentioned before, and the essential cartelisation of the banking structure, which just funnel money into big business pockets, which cost us far more than the upkeep of the poor in society.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, I think this should be done. But the point I was getting at more was that I don't necessarily think people on benefits deserve their money any more than big business. Okay. That's not the point I wanted to make.
Okay, but who are the real sponges? Who are the real problem in this country? People who milk the housing benefit system, or people like the chief executive of Kent County Council who earns £120,000 a year?
Okay, but it's the motive is the same. They still have the same objective. They're trying to get as much money as they possibly can.
But
if they could get more money, they would.
but this is within the context of a system which, as you were describing, but in lots of other ways as well, just seems to keep the worst off in society down, just in so many ways. All the laws seem to be engendered to be biased against certain sections of society. And within that context, it's not that bad that they're giving money at the same time.
I completely agree, but all I wanted to say really was people who are poor are not people who are on benefits. That, you know,
Okay.
that's not the same thing.
Yes. Of course, there should eventually be a radical scaling back of state benefits, but not until there are alternative means in existence for the poor to look after themselves. And we should not allow ourselves to be regarded as the enemies of the poor. We're not, and we shouldn't be regarded as such. Another point I'd make is that is it your sister-in-law, your sister?
Stepsister.
Your stepsister. Okay, her 3 children and her breast implants. Yes, of course. That deserves a double-page write-up in the Daily Mail, doesn't it? But what harm does your stepsister do to the people in this room and the people in this country? She takes a bit of money out of our pockets. Well, big deal. What harm does the Chief Executive of Kent County Council do to the taxpayers in Kent? What harm do all of these very well-paid bureaucrats and bureaucratic hangers-on do? A great deal. They are the people whose incomes must be taxed.
You say what harm do they do, but it harms her children to begin with because they're born into the benefits culture, and they will eventually become, dependent on the state as well. And it carries on this lifestyle which, it lasts generations and you can't really break up this. So it does a lot of harm to society.
It does a lot of harm to a limited number of people. And I'm not actually sure how much harm your stepsister will be doing to her children. It is surprising how people can snap out of this given the right incentives. But the huge amounts of money given to well-connected tax eaters, that is dangerous because these people do not simply pocket their salaries and do nothing else. It's not like old corruption in the 18th century where gentlefolk would turn up 4 times a year in Whitehall, sign a piece of paper and then get their £200 pensions for doing nothing at all. It's not like that. The kind of tax eaters we're now facing are activists. They're always looking for ways to extend their status and their income and the numbers of people like them. They are the danger. The underclass, they are a nuisance to themselves and they are occasionally a nuisance to the rest of us when they come looking for a bit of extra cash.
But you just distanced us from them, you did it just then.
Of course.
And do you not see that there's a problem that you are just, you're just completely denying any kind of, potential for independence? And
Sorry, can you explain that?
Okay, what I'm saying is basically you do see people on benefits, especially where I live. You do see them walking down the street, and there's no way they are ever going to break out of it. Ever, it just doesn't happen. If you're born into that lifestyle.
What wasn't the point he was making? Is because they don't have anything else to do.
No, this is the thing, because there are jobs sometimes, even if it's Tesco's. Okay, I know people seem to hate Tesco's, but it is a choice. It is a choice to go on benefits, and it may be an easy.
Why on earth would you want to work in Tesco? I just can't see the motivation ever in getting on benefits if the only option is working in Tesco.
You're assuming everyone is like you, but you go to Oxford University, you don't want to work at Tesco's, but lots of people hate to be where you are right now discussing Libertarianism.
I think a large part of the problem is, or at least a part of the problem, is the fact that many people on benefits are capable of earning a better living than they can from the equivalent work they can get. I've got quite a few friends who have been trying to get work for a very long time, trying to get part-time jobs in McDonald's or Tesco's or wherever. But they find out that getting the work means their benefits are reduced more than they would earn from the work, meaning that even if you discount the cost of their time, it's not worth their while, actually looking for work unless they can get a full-time job, which is of course really quite difficult to find in their experience. So they get sucked into the cycle, and I mean, luckily my friends recently sort of got an actual job at McDonald's, but I think it's important, whilst also supporting small businesses, not to be overly disparaging of jobs like McDonald's and Tesco's and so forth, because they do provide a reasonable living for people who couldn't realistically make significant money any other way.
Well, I agree. I agree with that, and I think that one thing we haven't really touched on is the fact that the best way to increase the overall pay rate, or at least the best way I think we ought to increase the overall pay rate, and the best way that the overall pay rate, especially for the worst off, has been increased, is through investment in capital and having better production processes which allow us to produce more, and that means that the product of workers is going to be higher, and
means the food they have to buy is a lot cheaper.
Which means the food they have to buy is cheaper, which is a good point, which I was going to ignore. But also their wages are going to be higher because they're going to be worth more to the employer. I mean, without going, you don't need to go much into economics to find out that if you increase the stock of capital, the marginal product of labour is higher. And it's just simply true historically, and if we look in theory, that building up, investing and creating more efficient processes and more productive processes increases the lot of not just those who profit, but also those who work there and the general society as a whole.
That's true. All that capital stock in housing didn't work out that well, did it?
Sorry?
Increasing all the capital stock in housing didn't work out that well, did it? Like, we gotta find a way to put money into the right investments. And
Well,
the banking system haven't been failing at that.
Could I argue that the money that was put into banking wasn't invested into banking because investment requires saving, and what was actually done with housing was speculation, which I think is different, but the speculation only came on the back of a huge amount of new money and incredibly perverse incentives created by very, very poor regulations, which essentially I think created the system. And of course we can't let bankers off for their part in the crisis, but we have to realise that they have been told that what their job is to do is to make short-term profits and maximise their shares, and the incentive structure within their working is one which says that the best way to do this is to do the things they've been doing, make the bad investments they did make, because they were told that these were the right investments because of the what I was saying before, the perverse incentives created essentially by the state. So yeah.
Well, but don't you think that's a problem though? Like we did a huge amounts of savings in the world economy in the run-up to the financial crisis, like what they call the global savings gap. That you have Germans and Chinese people predominantly just saving huge amounts of money, and then like say British or American bankers investing them in not very wise ways.
I have heard economists in inverted commas like Paul Krugman say that somehow a global savings glut could have caused this, but I think that not only people who agree with me, but widely in the economics profession that views to spread. There's just no empirical evidence for that. Sorry?
Ben Bernanke's thesis, that global savings glut. And I think it's pretty, you can see that we're getting very technical here, but like every trade surplus, the flip side is capital outflow. And you see great trade surpluses in what I mentioned, China and Germany.
Well, I'm sure someone could address that point, but could I quickly point out that Ben Bernanke has a slight incentive to blame it on anyone else because he was one of the key architects of the crash. But that's what I'm going to say.
It was before the crash.
I was just to make one point on the benefits issue, which you've sort of made, but just on a technical level, that a lot of people on benefits favour high marginal tax rates. It's not actually a tax rate, but it's a sort of a marginal tax rate of going from benefits to work, sometimes over 90%. So you have very, very little incentive to offer. Effective marginal tax rate of going into work, and so when you've got a decision between being on benefits or working on a bad job, which really gives you a tiny bit extra because of this effective tax rate, it's an obvious one which one you should go for.
Especially when you can still do black market work.
Yeah, you can still do other things in pocket national side. And now I was just say maybe we do one more question and then we can get into the technical discussions over a drink afterwards for those who still want to hang around.
Last question?
I was just going to say about how you're talking before about how what we need for economic growth is a high savings ratio, and the savings are very important to kind of libertarian ideas of economic growth. But I've noticed two things which might kind of hamper that, which we've also talked about today, being very good libertarian principles. One of which is kind of big problem with big business. Big business is the best place to make decent capital investments over the long term because, for example, research and development, if say AstraZeneca can divert, say, 5% of their funds to research and development in bulk, get kind of returns to scale and make huge leaps forward. Whereas if you've got lots of kind of smaller companies doing a little bit, it's a lot harder to kind of find overall progress. Also, another thing, another observation I thought was about the whole benefits thing. I just think. Yeah, so we're talking about, you were saying about the guy in Kent on £120,000 a year. That's been proven that people who earn more money, are in the kind of high percentile earners, tend to save more than people lower down. So therefore, if we do kind of, end up with customer benefits and the rest of it, having people earning less money and so forth, those people then are going to, sorry, okay, just ignore the last one.
Okay, I was about to say that Bastiat had a good answer to that point. Okay, I accept that corporate big business as it exists is a wonderfully productive machine. We're not talking about Gosplan here, we're talking about a great deal of entrepreneurship embedded into state privileged structures. But I would still say that however much entrepreneurship is embedded, we're still talking about state privileged trading structures. And although you can point to certain advantages, you can point to the things we get, I do suspect, I do feel very strongly, indeed I do believe that evidence can be produced to back me up, that the cost, the opportunity cost of big business is actually very, very high. It is a question of what you see and what you don't see. You see the benefits that are given to us by Microsoft and IBM and Hewlett Packard and British Petroleum and the Ford Motor Company. What we don't see is the other wonderful things that we would get without them.
Chance?
Well, because they don't exist, I can't describe
it. So, do you think that we should kind of make regulations to break up, or create regulations to kind of create a break up or create formation of firms such as Microsoft? Because I can't instinctively thought the whole kind of libertarian ideal is to encourage people to go out and to expand and to build businesses and all the rest of it, rather than.
Well, Murray Rothbard said that any supposedly private organisation that gets more than, I think, was it 50% of its revenue from the state should be regarded as a part of the state and should simply be homesteaded by the people working within it. So a university would become a student lecturer cooperative, firms like General Motors would become worker cooperatives and so on, or they should be, we should make honest women of these corporations and nationalise them. They could then become formally owned by the state and then broken up and privatised. I don't think I'd go that far. I suppose what I would say is that one way to deal with this would be to increase corporation tax, shift a lot of taxation from income, national insurance, VAT to corporation tax, keep virtually all the health and safety regulations currently existing on joint stock limited liability corporations, but just to exempt every partnership, every sole trader, every unincorporated association from these things. And then you'd very quickly see a process of disincorporation throughout the economy. But of course, if I were to become the front man for a military coup tomorrow, and I tried to do these things, I don't think I'd last very long. But we've probably run out of time. So the last point I would make is to go back to the very first question we had about how to win the libertarian argument. One way to do it is to take part in cultural production. One of the reasons why socialism, one of the reasons why statism became so dominant within our culture was because a large number of brilliant writers, artists, filmmakers, etc., in the early and middle 20th century changed the public perception of the state, made the state seem good, made state solutions seem good. People like George Bernard Shaw, people like John Galsworthy, people like H.G. Wells, you fill in the blank, even George Orwell to some extent. And one way in which we can perhaps roll back the state in the intellectual sense is by writing our own novels and plays and making our own films. And a very good friend of mine, the critically acclaimed and international best-selling novelist Richard Blake, has produced, these are just some of the books he's written over the past few years. These are not hardcore libertarian propaganda in the sense of Atlas Shrugged. You don't have 50-page speeches on why A equals A and so on. But they are very quietly libertarian propaganda, and okay, they are genre novels, they're historical novels, but I would suggest that works like this are at least as valuable in putting the libertarian case as all those very worthy ASI tracts on why we must privatise the cracks between the paving stones. And so if you want to advance the libertarian argument, you could write books like this yourself, or what you could do is you could buy large numbers of these books from people like Richard Blake, the critically acclaimed and international best-selling novelist, and you could give them to your friends and loved ones as Christmas presents. you must have them uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters, fathers, people who seem to have everything. You know, those hard to satisfy people. Well, you know, there are only, I think we're now into 10 shopping weeks till Christmas, and the bookshops are filled with books such as Richard Blake, and so, yes.
Sorry, while we're on this, I'd just like to advertise how an economy grows and where it crashes as well.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yes. Basic economic literacy as an allegory of free men living on an island.
Excellent. That's not by Richard Blake, the critically acclaimed and novelist, but I'm sure it's equally worthy. And so, do support your local libertarian novelists, especially when they are as critically acclaimed and best-selling as the great Richard Blake, who now has a Facebook page, but for some reason he hasn't yet put up a photograph of himself.
Thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure.
Yeah, so basically, we'll be going over the road to the Old Town. Well, that's where we usually go. Do you want to go anywhere else, James?
No.
To have a drink if you want to discuss anything further.
If anyone wants to sign down who isn't on the mailing list, just wants to know what other events we're doing over the term, then here's the place to sign down. The other thing is that next week, I think it's the same time, same place, and same day, but next week, we have Terence Keeley speaking.